The committee is meeting today to continue its engagements on the Industrial and Provident Society's Amendment Bill 2018. I would like to welcome, representing the Irish Co-op Organisation Society, Ms Sinead Farrell and Mr Dara Walsh. From the Centre for Cooperative Studies at UCC, Dr Olive McCarthy and Ms Bridget Carroll. And representing the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, Mr Brendan Murta and Ms Katrina Alice. This session will be followed by engagement with officials from the Department of Business Enterprise and Innovation. Can I remind members, visitors and those in the public gallery to please ensure their mobile phones are switched off or in flight mode for the duration of this meeting, as they interfere with the broadcasting equipment even when on silent mode. In accordance with procedure, I am required to read out the following. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members have been circulated with the presentation submitted by today's attendees. So I now ask Ms Sinead Farrell and Mr Dara Walsh from the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society to make their presentation to the committee. And could I just thank all six of you and those with you for giving up your time and coming in here today. Is much appreciated.
Chair and members of the Oireachtas, I'd like to firstly thank you for the opportunity this afternoon to discuss the detailed scrutiny of the Industrial Provident Society's Amendment Bill 2018. By way of introduction, ICOS serves and promotes cooperative businesses and enterprises across multiple sections of the Irish economy, making ICOS the leading organisation for registering new cooperatives in Ireland and reliable, experienced advisors on cooperative rules and governance in Ireland. Our core business is to provide leadership to the cooperative movement in Ireland. We use our collective voice to put the needs of the cooperative movement and our member co-ops to the forefront of what we do. We draw upon the pioneering and innovative spirit of our founding members to help strengthen our cooperatives operating in today's ever-changing and competitive world. Starting from the agricultural cooperative path set by our founding president, Sir Horace Plunkett, in 1894, ICOS today has evolved to serve the cooperative sector in 7 core categories, namely multi-purpose dairy cooperatives, in the livestock sector, store, trade and wholesale, service-related co-ops, community-oriented culture and leisure co-ops, and food, forestry and fishing and beverage, as well as advisory and education. ICOS member cooperatives, their subsidiaries and associated entities collectively have over 150,000 individual members owning shares in them, employ more than 14,000 people in Ireland and a further 24,000 abroad, and have combined turnover of almost 15 billion. A significant proportion of this turnover is spent throughout Ireland in the following ways: employee wages, payments to suppliers such as farmers and other small rural businesses, and dividends paid to the 150,000 cooperative members. In addition to the economic benefits, cooperatives place great emphasis on enhancing the skills of cooperative staff and management. They do this via the ICOS SkillNet training programmes. This allows cooperatives of all sizes avail of a wide variety of training resources in order to develop their skills of their personnel. Moving on to the bill, and firstly on the reduction of the minimum number of members from 7 to 3, ICOS has reservations about the proposed reduction of special members for a number of reasons. We are of the view that it does nothing to materially promote the 7 principles of cooperation in the manner that the current figure does. For example, the existing requirement of member numbers encourages the principles of voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation and concern for community by simply requiring more people to be involved from the start. Cooperative societies are sustained best where market failure drives collectivism and loyalty. To mitigate this market failure and drive the collectivism, there needs to be some level of scale. In ICOS experience, the 7-member requirement, though not a guarantee of that necessary scale, is at least a strong indication of it. ICOS has a degree of concern that the reduction could lead to what we term cosmetic cooperatives, where a business is operating as a limited company while holding themselves out as a cooperative in order to artificially gain good public relations and goodwill. If there are to be benefits, whether in statute or in government policy for cooperatives, the very reason of promoting the original market failure and, as it were, achieve together what you cannot on your own logic of cooperatives, then surely to reduce the minimum membership opens up greater risk of abuse by individuals who would otherwise pursue another type of corporate vehicle. If, as a result of the Industrial and Provident Societies Act review, it transpires that the existing 7 is reduced to a lower number, we'd strongly advocate that access to establishing cooperatives at that reduced number must come with strict criteria to mitigate the risks we've just now outlined. As an aside, in ICOS experience of establishing cooperatives, the member limit is not a barrier to successful cooperative establishment. What is a barrier to successful establishment is start-up cooperatives not qualifying for certain supports, for example, innovation vouchers, which are currently widely available to companies. This in turn discriminates against the cooperative model and thus reduces the number of cooperatives being established. Moving on to the annual return exemption, as termed, the bill in section 14, termed annual return, relates to the filling of statutory accounts to the registrar. ICOS continues to support the transparency of filing accounts and the annual return through the AR15 through the register. However, ICOS does support audit exemption for cooperative societies subject to specific criteria. Over the last number of years, ICOS has received increasing requests for assistance from our small to medium-sized affiliates in relation to their growing compliance burden. In addition, we have lost potential new cooperatives due to the prohibitive cost of having a statutory audit carried out. This results in them being unable to pursue the preferred corporate model and thus losing out on the cooperative benefits. While recognising the key role a robust regulatory framework plays in providing stability and fairness in the economy, ICOS would be in favour of statutory audit exemption provided clearly defined criteria are set out in the legislation as follows. The society's turnover not to exceed a number X, the society's balance sheet total not to exceed a number X, the number of employees not to exceed a number X, and the society's membership not to exceed a number X. In addition to the society's rulebook providing for the exemption, and the Society's rulebook requiring an appropriate periodic approval by an appropriate majority of the membership for the Society to implement the said exemption for the Society's accounts. In relation to criteria 5 and 6 outlined above, we would strongly advocate that these fundamental points be varied only by an amendment to primary legislation. In closing, I note the strength of the cooperative is that the members own and oversee the organisation. Cooperatives are answerable to their members and to future generations of members. It is essential that this strategic involvement is facilitated and promoted by any changes to legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Welch. We'll now move on to Dr. McCarthy. Is it? Or okay, Ms. Carroll, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So, just by way of background, the Centre for Cooperative Studies is a research centre based at University College Cork, which promotes education, training and research into cooperatives, social enterprises and local development. And cooperatives are jointly owned and democratically controlled businesses that provide goods and services to their member owners who work together for mutual benefit. And cooperatives act as a means of facilitating collective action in many sectors of the economy, such as financial services, housing, food processing, marketing, retailing, community health, social care services and enterprise development. And the International Cooperative Alliance, which is an apex body for cooperatives, estimates that it represents close to 1 billion members of cooperatives, which employ 250 million people and generate over $2 trillion in turnover across the world. So, with reference to the proposed amendment of Section 5 and Section 9, the intention of this section of the amendment bill is to reduce the number of members required to establish a cooperative to 3 from 7. I suppose as mutual organisations, a distinct feature of cooperatives is that a group of people come together with a shared purpose to meet their common needs. And in many cases, that will necessitate a comparatively large group of people, such as in the case of agricultural processing or marketing, in the provision of utilities such as water or housing, or in retailing, where a large membership base may be needed to achieve economies of scope or scale, and where the services provided to the members or the potential members by the cooperative are likely to be in considerable demand. In other situations, however, the number of initial members needed to form a cooperative is likely to be much lower. For example, in the case of startups, for example, worker or employee-owned cooperatives, which can operate in any sector of the economy, the initial membership base may be more similar to conventional non-cooperative startups. And there is some evidence that a requirement to have a minimum number of 7 is high for these groups wishing to operate as a cooperative. And it is likely to be higher than the average numbers involved in start-up companies in Ireland. So I suppose consequences of the requirement to have 7 members at the outset for such co-ops may include potential cooperatives choosing other models of incorporation which may not align with the cooperative ethos or practice or the ideals of the owners, may not be what they want, and use of proxy members. You've already had some international comparison, and we've looked at the cooperatives unit of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which, as you know, is an agency of the UN. And they collate the minimum number of cooperative members required to register a cooperative across member states. And of these, the following have a requirement for 3 members: the UK, Canada, Italy, Spain, Germany, Finland, Japan, Belgium, the Czech Republic and Uruguay. There are some others who require a higher number, but many have a requirement of 3. And I suppose there's also work in progress by the International Cooperative Alliance that reports that in countries where, for example, the worker cooperatives are well developed, the minimum number of founding members are low. So 2 in France, 3 in Italy and 3 in Spain. So I suppose the proposed amendment brings the legislation more in line with international practice and more in line with companies' legislation in Ireland. And also importantly, I think it addresses the ILO recommendation 193 from 2002, which applies to all types and all forms of cooperatives and recommends that cooperatives should be treated on terms no less favourable than those accorded to other forms of enterprise and social organisation. And it goes on to recommend that governments should provide a supportive policy and legal framework consistent with the nature and function of cooperatives, and establish a framework that would allow for the registration of cooperatives in a rapid, simple, affordable and efficient manner as possible. So we know cooperatives around the world in many sectors of the economy, in many parts of the world, are very diverse, and they may develop in novel ways in the future. And I suppose our feeling is that they shouldn't be hampered from doing so. Worker cooperatives are few at present in Ireland, and perhaps they're not sufficiently attended to by the current legislation. And changing the minimum number, it may be helpful, and it is unlikely to have much of a cost implication. Having said that, a counter-argument could be made that reducing the number to 3 could lead to a misinterpretation of what a cooperative is in terms of an organisation committed to providing solutions on a mutual and voluntary basis, open to all who can use the services and share in its benefits. And I suppose in that context, the number 3 would make little sense for many cooperative sectors aiming to provide a service widely, such as, the traditional sectors of credit and agriculture. However, as mentioned earlier, there are cases where 7 sets the bar quite high, which might include enterprise development and new areas, which might include youth employment initiatives, which I think are of particular interest to this committee. And it's also important to remember that the legislation, this purported legislation and legislation, I suppose, in general, is just one piece of the jigsaw of co-op development. A range of other supports and easily accessible information on cooperatives is required in order to facilitate more use of the model. We note that when promoted by the Cooperative Development Unit back in the 80s and 90s, with support from the government and trade unions and others, there was a marked uptake of the model. And similarly, support from Oireachtas na Gaeltachta over the years has seen a community cooperative sector emerge. So countries which provide such supports tend to have a vibrant cooperative sector. So I suppose on balance, we support the proposed amendment to reduce the number of members required to establish a cooperative to 3. It would make registration easier, and we don't envisage any significant unintended consequences. Moving on then to the amendment of section 14. So the intention of the amendment is to make regulations exempting a specific class of societies from the obligation to file annual returns and other specified documents. And I believe that the sponsor, Deputy Daly, has already acknowledged that this part of the amendment requires some rewording or redrafting. In a recent, even though small, but a recent study that we conducted down in UCC, we were looking at cooperative startups. We were looking at how people are using the cooperative model today, what facilitates them and what barriers do they experience. And we found that members of very small-scale cooperatives felt that what was required of them in terms of audit accounts and returns was disproportionate to their scale of operations and little different to the application of larger cooperatives. So, the audit requirement, it can be costly, it can be an administrative burden on small societies. However, there are clear benefits to having audited accounts in terms of transparency and trust. We recommend retaining the requirement of annual returns and audit accounts while allowing specified societies to apply for an audit exemption under certain conditions, which might include an asset size, turnover threshold, or such criteria as outlined by ICOS. As is the case in companies' legislation. I think we don't need to spend much time on the use of electronic communication. As of December 2018, the RFS online portal has been available, so I think that takes care of that. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Carroll. And now I will ask Mr. Brendan Murtagh, please, to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am representing the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, which is a global professional body of accountants supporting 219,000 members and 527,000 students in 179 countries. In Ireland, we support 12,000 members and 8,000 students. ACCA was invited to make a submission to the Committee on the Industrial and Provident Societies Amendment Bill 2018. In that submission, we identified that the bill is a limited scope amendment to very old legislation, and our comments are limited to the matters being amended. We identified two substantive issues which we believe the committee should consider and some minor technical amendments. Overall, we welcome the bill as it serves to reduce the administrative burden for industrial and provident societies. The two substantive issues are as follows. We believe that the industrial and provident societies should be required to prepare financial statements in accordance with generally accepted accounting practices, commonly known as GAAP, and this is a similar provision to that required in companies' legislation. The requirement for an annual return is substantially undermined if the financial statements attaching to that annual return are not standard. We believe that the Minister should be given the power to prescribe the form and content of the financial statements for industrial and provident societies by way of regulation. We have no evidence of abuse in this area, but we have anecdotal evidence from our membership of different approaches being adopted for the disclosure by different industrial and provident societies. This leads to a lack of comparability and potential obfuscation of details that might be important to stakeholders. Prescribing a set of rules to follow, as is done in company legislation, will ensure consistency. We also believe that audit exemption should be available to industrial and provident societies on a similar basis to audit exemption as currently available to companies limited by guarantee. This will serve to reduce the administrative burden for the smallest of industrial and provident societies, while also allowing any single member to require an audit. On a more technical point, we have a concern that Section 14A2 does not appear to be linked to Section 14A1. These sections allow the Minister grant exemption from public filing of annual returns and financial statements for certain classes of industrial and provident societies. In our opinion, the exemption under 14A1 should be available where the generality of 14A2 is also met. We think these two sections need to be linked. We also believe the committee should consider changing the may to will, requiring the Minister to provide an alternative when they provide an exemption rather than making it optional. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murtagh. I'm just going to start there with a question to yourself, Mr. Murtagh, that I picked up there. In number one, the requirement for an annual return is substantially undermined if the financial statements attaching to the annual return are non-standard. Will you just explain that a little bit more, please?
Certainly. So, within the company legislation, it prescribes that there has to be a certain framework under which the financial statements are prepared. So that means that you've got a consistency of the accounting treatment and a consistency of the disclosures in those financial statements. Currently, there's no equivalent prescription, which means that any individual industrial or provident society could, in effect, make their own determination on the accounting treatment or the disclosure, rather than what would be generally acceptable.
Okay, so that's the non-standard, yeah. Thank you very much for that. Senator MacLochlainn.
Yeah, thanks very much for all of you for your presentations today. I think it's fair to say that the ACCA and the Centre for Cooperative Studies, that in fairness, ACCA only commented on the annual returns and audit element of it, but it's fair to say that both of you are broadly in agreement with the legislation, and as you've indicated, there is an acceptance by those who are putting forward the legislation, the need for amendments to clarify the annual statements dimension. So my question goes to the Irish Cooperative Organisation, the ICOS. You would have listened to the presentation from Ms Carroll, and I appreciate that your organisation is focused heavily in the area of agriculture and food. Would you accept the point by Ms Carroll that that they acknowledge in their presentation that your model of cooperatives obviously does require, and the likes of credit unions, that it does require a wider membership base, economies of scale for it to succeed, but there are other models of cooperatives that could and indeed would need a reduction on the current number of 7, and you've seen the international comparison there. And indeed, in a previous hearing where Deputy Daly was here, she argues that because of the barrier that we have, where there has to be the ceiling of 7, that the potential of the cooperative model is not working in Ireland in comparison to those other countries that have a lower threshold. So I just want to get your response to those arguments and the points from Ms Carroll from the Centre for Cooperative Studies.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
Yeah, we know that it has been mentioned that there may be certain sectors that it's been mentioned that there could be need for a lower amount. But as we said in our opening comments, if that's to come in, it needs to be brought in with caution and with the right criteria to avoid the number of pitfalls and the reservations we have being avoided. So that's pretty much what I'd say to that, unless my colleague Sinead has anything to add.
Just in addition to that, we are, in our own experience, we haven't had any issues with getting 7 members to date. We've always managed to get 7 members, there may be limited numbers of cases that we need to reduce the figure, but we've never come across an issue where we've had any actually getting the 7 people. I am aware that there is other countries that do have reduced members, but we also need to look at, are they the principles that they're following through with, are they successful co-ops? The whole purpose of a cooperative is for economies of scale and for coming together for the common purpose. And is that feasible with 3 people? Maybe 7 would be ideal, because there's more people there to help, promote their own ideals and their own the common goal that they're coming together for. So in our experience, we haven't any reason to reduce it to 7 or from 7. So.
But you would accept that predominantly you're focused on agriculture and food sectors, and in other sectors, as is pointed out by by Ms Carroll, speaking on behalf of the Centre, that's it may be important or necessary to reduce the number for their models to be successful.
Well, to be honest, we do have a lot of agricultural cooperatives, but we also do have non-agricultural cooperatives. Like we deal with store trade, wholesales. We've got service-related cooperatives, communities. We've even got food, beverages, like tea, coffee shops. We cater for them all. We're open to them all. We don't. If you're a co-op, you're welcome to come to us. We don't pick and choose. They come to us for.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I'm happy with that. Yeah.
If we could just tease it out a little bit further with you, Ms Carroll or Dr McCarthy. You said, on balance, we support the proposed amendment to reduce the number of members required to establish a cooperative to 3, but you did have still some reservations.
So where our thinking comes from is that while 3 might be a minimum, that's not necessarily a target. So, growth obviously is particularly important. So even though you may have 3 starting off the cooperative, and so specifically we're thinking about the area of worker cooperatives, where many start-up companies, for example, would have maybe 1, 2 maybe 3 people establishing those worker co-ops, or sorry, establishing those start-up companies. And so to put, I suppose, the worker cooperative on an equal footing, then 3 would be, I suppose, an ideal number to enable more worker co-ops to get started. But we're not thinking that it would stay at 3 forever necessarily, and perhaps indeed what a worker co-op should be striving to do is to grow its numbers and to become much bigger over time. And we see examples from France where worker co-ops can start with 3, but on average over the last 4 years there's been 70 worker co-ops where the numbers have grown to almost 21 members in each of those. So we would see it not as a target but as a starting point to facilitate the setup of cooperatives, but not necessarily as the number that it's always going to be at.
Thank you. Senator Reilly.
Thank you very much, and to thank our guests for their presentations. Just a couple of issues, and in fact I think Dr McCarthy went some way towards addressing the issue that Senator MacLochlainn was raising, which is one I wanted to raise myself. Obviously one size doesn't fit all, and a workers' cooperative is a very different thing to an agricultural co-op or a huge co-op of retailers or whatever. And at the point it's been made, when they start small. So perhaps some of the concerns that you have raised could be addressed by some of the issues raised and terms and conditions for exemptions raised. In other words, that it would be influenced by the number of members in a co-op and its turnover. As it gets bigger, that the number involved has to increase. Because obviously what we're trying to do here is to ensure that a workers' co-op can start, that they can benefit from the cooperative status, and that innovation and enterprise isn't just limited to those who have, serious money to invest, but we can encourage that worker-owned cooperative principle, which I think is a good principle. I'm just wondering about this innovation voucher. I don't know much about it, and you might tell me what it is, and you might also explain why it is that startup cooperatives don't qualify for it, whereas businesses do. And then the last thing is obviously to mention the fact that auditing and filing accounts has to be an integral part of any business. Auditing is obviously very expensive, so the criteria around that obviously need to be reviewed, and the bill could address that perhaps through amendments. But certainly filing of accounts is a must, as far as I think anybody would be concerned who's in business or who's in a co-op, who would be concerned that the accounts have been made properly and that there isn't room for issues arising, which we've had all too often in this country in so many different organisations, big and small. People need to be protected. Not everybody in a co-op, small or big, is gifted with the expertise to spot problems arising. They do depend on professionals for that. So I think really the question I want to ask is more for information for myself around the innovation vouchers, etc.
Thank you.
I can respond on that one. So that's one that's come up on my radar, particularly when I'm dealing with our newer and smaller cooperatives who are approaching local enterprise offices and those kind of bodies for support and funding. And I believe that the innovation voucher is one of those supports offered by the local enterprise offices. And they have, once again, it's come back to me anecdotally on a couple of occasions in the last few months that they have been turned down for eligibility for such a support, and the reason given was that they were a cooperative and that they were either advised to set up as a private company or a company limited by guarantee, or if they were already operating as a co-op, that was the reason they were given, and for not qualifying. It could mean the difference between an idea getting off the ground or a co-op getting to the next level in what they're trying to do and not doing so, even though the figures talked about are relatively small, but for those co-ops operating on that level, it could be a big percentage of turnover, or as I said, it could be the figure that gets them off the ground or gets them to the next level.
It's very clear it's a disincentive to co-ops versus somebody setting up their own business. And I mean, whilst we want to encourage both, I don't think we should be favouring one over the other. So certainly the department didn't ask you after you, so we'll be asking them about that.
Senator Humphreys, you're okay. Senator Davitt, are you all right?
I'm okay. No, I think we've heard enough.
Okay. I just have another question there I want to ask Ms. Carroll, maybe, or whoever. You might like to comment on it as well, Mr. Murtaugh. We're talking about now amendment of Section 14 of the Principal Act, right, which is in relation to audits again. So we recommend retaining the requirement for annual returns and audited accounts while allowing specified societies to apply for an audit exemption under certain conditions which might include an asset size turnover threshold, as in the case in companies legislation. I know that's what Mr Welch just spoke about there, but if you could just expand a little bit and your thoughts on that as well, Mr Murtaugh, please.
Well, we weren't going to prescribe what we were going to confine ourselves. We're not accountants. We were going to confine ourselves to making the recommendation because it's something that we hear from cooperatives, and it came up in some research we were doing. So we weren't going to get into the criteria. I think some of the criteria that ICOS mentioned sound very sensible. But I suppose what we were alluding to there was that this already exists, not willy-nilly for everybody that's a company. It applies in specific circumstances, and I suppose that's what we could look at in terms of trying to, in terms again of the level playing pitch.
Okay, Mr Murtaugh, yeah.
We're in agreement as well that there does need to be some form of exemption regime, and that already exists within the Companies Act. So in terms of ensuring that stakeholders are protected insofar as is possible, those criteria have already been established within company law, and they relate to turnover, they relate to assets, and they relate to number of employees, and they are reasonably substantial thresholds within company law. But there is also a protection. So if you look at something that would potentially be analogous, if we look at companies limited by guarantee, where we're looking to protecting a membership in that respect, there is the override that if there is a single member who is not comfortable with the fact that the company is availing of an exemption, they can require an audit. So commercially, in terms of what is protecting stakeholder interests, we think that the exemption thresholds are appropriate, provided you have that safeguard. I think our issue here as well is that there should be a correlation between this bill and what is happening in the Companies Act in terms of the numbers, and if there is a change, it shouldn't necessarily be ignored. There should be a direct impact of that change, such that if it is deemed that the thresholds should be larger, that it would trigger a review in terms of the thresholds established in terms of industrial and provident societies, and vice versa.
Very much. Any further questions? Would anyone like to make any final comment? As you know, this is we're doing a legislative scrutiny of the bill, so the onus is on us to listen to what you all have to say and to try and, we're going to listen to the department next, and then we will put a report together as a committee, whether we support what's in the bill or not. So we have to stand back and look at it purely, from a point of view that we don't want to make bad legislation. Yeah, Senator Reilly?
Yeah, just one comment that I meant to make, and I don't mean it to be seen as antagonistic to anybody, but obviously co-ops give economy of scale, but the other point of a co-op, particularly a workers' co-op, is to have more worker participation and ownership. So there's more than one issue driving this bill. Okay,
no problem. Any further comments before we conclude? Okay, I would like to thank you all for coming here today. I would like to thank you for your input and for attending today's meeting, and thank you very much for your submissions beforehand. They have been very useful. Thank you very much. I propose we suspend briefly to allow the departmental officials to take their seats. Is that agreed? Thank you. We will now resume the committee scrutiny of the Industrial and Provident Society's Amendment Bill to 2018. I would like to welcome to today's meeting from the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation Mr Gary Martin and Ms Theodora Corcoran and Mr Tommy Murray. We have received apologies from Ms Breda Power, Assistant Secretary, Commerce, Consumer and Competition Division. In accordance with procedure, I am required to read out the following. By virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you are directed by the Commission to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would also just like to welcome Ms Kiernan to the room. Thank you. Members have been circulated with the presentation submitted by today's attendees, and I now ask Mr Martin to make his opening statement to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to make a presentation on the Industrial and Provident Societies Amendment Bill 2018. The Department made a detailed submission on the Private Members Bill on the 10th of May, where we addressed the issues raised by the Joint Committee. Therefore, I will now confine my remarks to the main provisions of the bill. My comments will deal with the framing of the bill as an amendment to the Industrial and Provident Societies Acts 1893 to 2018. Its scope is determined by the proposed reduction in the number of members as a condition to form Industrial and Provident Societies in Section 2, the proposed exemption by regulations of specified classes of societies to file annual returns or certain specified classes of documents that would otherwise be required to be included as part of an annual return in Section 5, and the proposed registration of Industrial and Provident Societies and filing by electronic means in Section 6. The comments will draw, among other things, on stakeholder submissions to the public consultation on operation and implementation of the Industrial and Provident Societies Acts 1893 to 2014, recent submissions to the Department on the issues raised by the Private Members Bill by the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society, or ICOS, and the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, as well as examples of the way these issues have been addressed in cooperative legislation framework across Europe. We understand that the bill aims to make the process of establishing and registering a cooperative much easier. The Department fully recognises the continuing importance of the cooperative movement throughout Ireland. We are currently undertaking a root and branch review of the legislation with a view to consolidating and modernising it, and thus making it easier to understand and navigate. The committee will be aware that the Department has conducted a public consultation on the operation and implementation of the Industrial and Provident Societies legislation. The 10 submissions received highlighted the need for a consideration of a wide range of issues, including providing cooperative societies with a distinct legislative identity reflecting the cooperative ethos, revising the provisions on debentures, allowing for a consolidated rulebook registration and electronic attendance and voting. The issues raised by the Private Members Bill also featured in some of the submissions. In addition, the Department is considering other issues, including modernising the language, removing references to other jurisdictions, governance and the powers of the Registrar of Friendly Societies, RFS. Following the completion of a comprehensive review of the legislative framework, it is proposed that a general scheme for modernised and consolidated legislation will be brought forward later this year. It will consolidate into one statute all existing Industrial and Provident Societies legislation and modernise it to ensure a level playing field between cooperatives and the other legal options for structuring enterprise activities. It will also provide a conducive framework for realising the potential for the diverse range of organisations using the cooperative model. I'll just move on now to talk about reducing the number of members. So Section 2 of the Private Members Bill proposes to reduce the number of members as a condition of registration of industrial and provident societies from 7 to 3. The sponsors of the bill indicated that the rationale for reducing the membership criterion to 3 is based on the average number of employees in SMEs, which they currently put at 3.87 employees per business. The sponsors also noted that the proposed minimum membership criterion prevails in the rest of Europe, where the reduction in the minimum number of members has not resulted in unintended consequences. As part of the review of the Industrial and Provident Societies legislation, the Department has analysed the submissions received, conducted research on the practice across Europe, and is engaging in bilateral discussions with stakeholders to explore the various policy options in relation to this issue. While 3 out of the 10 submissions to the public consultation have suggested a reduction in the minimum number of members, there was no consensus on what this minimum number should be. For example, the Centre of Cooperative Studies in University College Cork suggested a reduction to 3 members. Cooperation Works proposed a minimum of 2 members, and Cooperative Housing Ireland requested a reduction to either 2 or 3 members. In addition, recent submissions to the Department from 2 of the cooperative umbrella organisations, the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society, or ICOS, and the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, do not indicate support for reducing the minimum number of members to 3. While the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, which has over 400 affiliate group water scheme members, had no difficulty with reducing the minimum number of members, it considered that 3 is low given the community nature of these societies and the vital importance of proportional representation, particularly when a society is being established. ICOS, which represents 130 cooperative societies, were strongly of the view that the current requirement of 7 members has never acted as an impediment to the establishment of a sustainable cooperative. Different approaches have been taken across Europe regarding the minimum number of members to form a cooperative, ranging from 1 in Finland to 10 in Poland. The research on cooperative legislation indicates a trend in cooperative law to reduce this minimum number, which in Europe is currently of 3 members on average, according to the International Handbook of Cooperative Law 2013. The European Cooperative Statute requires 5 or more members for a cooperative straddling more than 1 EU country. In considering the provision to reduce the minimum number of members to form a cooperative from 7 to 3, regard must be had to the need to ensure that the reduction in the minimum number of members does not act as an impediment to the establishment of viable and sustainable cooperatives with members who have the necessary skills to run these entities. The Department fully recognises the importance of creating favourable conditions for encouraging a range of start-ups, including cooperatives, and is open to reducing the minimum number of members. The Department considers that the optimum number to establish sustainable cooperatives will need to be carefully examined to ensure it meets the needs of Irish cooperatives. As part of the review process, the Department is engaging bilaterally with stakeholders to establish, among others, the optimum minimum number of members. Okay, I'll now move on to the section on the exemption from filing annual returns or documents included as part of an annual return. So Section 5 of the Private Members Bill provides for the Minister to exempt by regulations specified classes of societies to file annual returns or certain specified classes of documents that would otherwise be required to be included as part of an annual return. The Bill provides that these exemptions may correspond to exemption provisions applying to companies. None of the responses to the public consultation requested exemptions from filing annual returns, as the Private Members Bill proposes. However, some responses, 5 out of the 10, requested the introduction of audit exemptions for cooperatives in line with the approach taken in the Companies Act 2014. The concept of an audit exemption applicable to companies derives from EU law, and the threshold criteria which apply are set down by the EU. Private companies which satisfy certain conditions can be exempted from the requirement to have their financial statements audited. There is no similar regime on audit exemptions at EU level in respect of cooperatives. The available information indicates that Member States provide audit exemptions which could be based on the exemption thresholds applying in EU company law or nationally set thresholds. We note that at the meeting of this committee held on the 11th of June, the sponsors of the bill indicated that their intention was to seek audit exemptions rather than exemptions from filing annual returns. In light of that, I have not gone into any detail about the provisions on exempting cooperatives from filing annual returns as drafted in the bill. The issue of introducing audit exemptions for cooperatives is being considered under the current comprehensive review. The Department is supportive of introducing audit exemptions for cooperatives and is working with stakeholders to establish the appropriate criteria for exempting cooperatives from having to have their accounts audited. Finally, I'll just take this section on online registration and filing by electronic means. So Section 6 of the Private Members Bill provides for the registration of industrial and provident societies by filing and filing by electronic means. While these are clearly worthwhile provisions, they have been overtaken by events. The Industrial and Provident Societies Forms Regulations of 2018, which provide for the introduction of electronic filing for the most frequently filed RFS forms, came into effect on the 13th of September 2018. The RFS online facility was launched on the 6th of December 2018. It allows for the registration of new entities online and filing by electronic means of annual returns, amendments, including partial and full rule amendments, making online payments for filings and ordering documents online. The electronic forms are available on an optional basis. The fees for the RFS submissions were also changed in August 2018 to bring them in line with similar fees used by the CRO, the Companies Registration Office. The new regulations included a provision for the reduction in fees for documents filed online. In conclusion, the Department recognises the important role of the cooperative model in Ireland, and it is clear that there is support from stakeholders of the goal to modernise the legislation and align it with the realities of the 21st century business and regulatory environment. We are happy to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Martin. Senator Humphreys, have you any questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just kind of two brief questions in relation to the audit exemption. You're saying is consideration is currently under review. How long will that comprehensive review take place, or is it how long is a piece of string?
No, it's a piece of string. As a length, we are planning to bring the general scheme of bill by the end of this year, towards the end of this year. So that would include provisions such as the audit exemption. And as I said in the open statement, I suppose while the Department is supportive of introducing an audit exemption, the matter that needs to be analysed further with stakeholders and via the research we've conducted over many different countries is that it varies what they've applied. It's not set out in EU law, and stakeholders have different views, particularly as regards the safeguards that should be applied with that audit exemption and a specific sort of criteria for the thresholds to be applied in terms of number of members, employees, turnover, and balance sheet. So that's something that we'll have to explore in further detail, and we're doing that at the moment.
And then just in relation, you seem to be very open-minded to the reduction in the number of members of a co-op. Would that be correct?
The Department's definitely open to looking at the reduction of members. I suppose the question is, what should it be reduced to? And as I outlined, even from the stakeholders, there's a diverse range of opinions, as you've heard here earlier today as well. A number of groups, representative groups, including the National Federation for Group Water Schemes, who we actively sought their views because they hadn't responded to our consultation. They represent, I think, over a third of the current societies that are registered. And they have indicated that while they would support a reduction, 3 may not be the correct number. ICOS, as you've heard today, have strongly said that they would not like that minimum number to be reduced, and they've outlined their reasons for that, while others have indicated that they'd like us to bring it down to 3. So we'll have to explore that further with some more of the stakeholders bilaterally, including the Cooperative Housing Ireland, who put forward a case in a consultation response for it to be reduced as well, and we're planning to meet them in the coming weeks.
Sorry, Chair. Have you looked at, in relation to kind of, the notorious unintentional consequences in relation to reducing the numbers? Have you identified any consequences or any fears in relation to reducing the number? Then, because Deputy Daly makes the point about the, SMEs are about, 3.5. So that's why she's arguing in relation to the number as 3. But have you looked at any kind of fears in relation to unintentional consequences?
We haven't identified any evidence-based unintended sort of consequences that may arise from our research as yet in other countries. However, we are aware of the concerns that have been raised here today by a number of stakeholders to go on to such a low sort of threshold. So there are pros and cons, and I suppose we have to explore those in more detail.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Davitt.
Sorry now, we've been a bit all over the place today with time delays and one thing and another, so I just had to take a call there. Just one little thing I wanted to ask, I don't know if some of my colleagues have asked it here, but they were on about the innovation vouchers don't apply to co-ops. I wonder, is there any particular reason why that is or isn't? It's something that was pointed out earlier on. It's something that we feel probably should. It's small enterprise and startup enterprise. So that's really the query I'd like to address, if at all possible.
I can address that. Yeah, no, I heard that earlier on, and I'd be very interested in learning exactly under what criteria they were refused these innovation vouchers, because, as far as we are concerned, there is no discrimination irrespective of size of company, sole trader, small company, big company. They all can come in. The Leo doors are open for everybody. It's a first-stop shop.
Experience.
Yeah, so I'd be really interested to find out under what criteria.
When I heard it here, I was saying it to James.
We've given funding to cooperatives already in the past, so I don't see what the impediment could be.
No, I don't know. I'd say it's misconstrued. I'd say myself anyway.
Yeah, but I'd be interested in finding out if we could.
Okay.
At that stage,
well, thanks for that clarity. I think it's very, very important. So just to summarise, I'm going to start with the amendment of Section 14 of the Principal Act. Having listened to everyone who have come here before us today, I think everybody accepts there are clear benefits to having audited accounts in terms of openness and transparency. I think that's very, very important. But we seem to have a general consensus that the Department is supportive of introducing audit exemptions, and all the witnesses we had previous to yourselves coming in that you listened to, they were supportive of that as well. So hopefully there can be some common ground found there, which is very important. I suppose when we look at the first section, which is just to simplify, reducing the members of a co-op to set it up from 7 to 3, I suppose the point I'd like to make is all cooperatives are different, and whereas 3 might work for some, it mightn't work for others. A 7 is a lot, and the figure 5 hasn't been used at all while we have been discussing this, and I'm just wondering, would it be might it be a way forward? Because I suppose when we look at small and medium enterprises, and quite rightly, as Senator Humphreys said there, the average I think is about 3.5 people. So maybe 7 is a burden for some cooperatives. Now, when you're talking about people who are on a group water scheme, that mightn't be burdensome because you might have a dozen or so houses, whatever. But I suppose, look, the fact that you are engaging at the moment is very, very welcome. As a committee here, our job is to scrutinise this particular bill. And I have to say, in fairness to this document we got from the Centre for Cooperative Studies from University College Cork, it was excellent, and it really kind of set it out. And the fact that, I suppose, on balance, they support the proposed amendment to reduce the number of members required to establish a cooperative to 3. So I suppose what the task of the department now is to prove that 3 may not work. I think that's your task now, to prove that maybe, you know, on balance, people feel that maybe 3 will work. Personally, if you were to ask me, and I'm involved in a lot of committees, I think 3 is a small number. You know, if I was between 3 and 7, I'd look at 5. I think the more people you have at the coalface of an organisation or a co-op is very, very helpful. But I do accept that there might be times when, you know, and maybe in very rural areas, that maybe at trying to set up a co-op, a specific co-op, maybe it was in relation to food or agriculture, whatever, it mightn't be possible to get more than 3 members. So I suppose you still have a body of work to do on this from the department's point of view. Anything else to conclude with? Would any of you like to make any closing comment in relation to it?
As I said, we look forward to further engaging with stakeholders bilaterally on the matter, and we'll aim to make the general scheme of the bill available by the end of the year. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank our witnesses for their time and for their engagement with the committee today. The Joint Committee's next meeting is scheduled for the 9th of July. I now propose we go into private session. Is that agreed? Thank you very much for your time. I've just one question.